Hi there and welcome back to Before Dieting. I'm your host, Bronwyn Fletcher. In today's episode, I'm going to be responding to a question that was sent in by Carla. She writes, in the episode on the 8 types of eating, you talked about relief eating. I'd never heard that term, but I know about the type of eating that gives me relief. Can you talk more about it and give an example? Thanks, Carla, for that question. It really is a question that opens the door to a type of eating that stays hidden for so many women. And it's also the type of eating women are reluctant to talk about due to the blame and shame that pile on that can happen. From a systems perspective, relief eating is usually incorrectly labelled as binging. But these days, the word binge is so far past its use-by date. We binge on Netflix and shopping and all sorts of other things. And also, when we use that word in relation to food and eating, it tends to carry judgment rather than insight. And remember, we're all on about getting rid of the shame out of conversations about weight. So what many women call a binge is not really a binge at all. It's actually relief eating. And relief eating is very different because it isn't about the act of choosing to overeat. It's your eating system stepping in to restore balance when a level of emotion has risen higher than you can manage. And relief eating is a much more accurate term because it includes the whole arc of the experience, which is not just one thing. There's actually a build-up. There's also the eating itself, which is a bit you'll be familiar with, and the stage after when the internal pressure finally drops away. So what is relief eating exactly? Well, it's the way that your eating system stabilizes itself. It's not hunger or a failure of willpower. It's also not about weakness. It's a correction mechanism. Your eating system was formed over your lifetime. And if you've listened to earlier episodes about family food culture, you'll know that most of it actually came from there. But it's also the emotional rules that you learned around food and whether and how much access you had to it. So food becomes the way you learned to keep steady when your life felt out of control. So when something disrupts that stability, whether it be fear or stress or pressure, criticism, your system will do whatever it can to bring it back into balance. And relief eating is one of the fastest ways it knows how to do that. But relief eating doesn't start with hunger. It begins with what I call hungering. Hunger is simple. That's where your stomach needs fuel. Hungering is the signal that something inside you has shifted out of balance. It's a disturbance that can feel like a restlessness or maybe tension. Some women describe it as an internal buzzing that they can't shake. But other women also talk about feeling numb. But whatever way it sort of shows up, hungering is your system saying the level of emotion is rising and we need to bring it back down. And so it's relief eating that happens when the system takes over to close that gap and bring that emotional level down. Let me give you a practical example. Imagine that in childhood, your eating system was built around fear. It could be fear of getting into trouble, or it could have been a fear of being abandoned. If food was the one reliable thing that kept those fears down, your system learned early that food equals survival. Now fast forward to adulthood, and you decide to lose weight. You reduce your portions, you cut snacks, remove carbs, you do all the usual dieting things. But when you lower the food level, which has been equated to survival, the fear level rises. Then your system sees that rising fear as danger. The rising pressure is an emotional disturbance that we call hungering. And of course, it's that hungering, as I've been saying, that actually triggers relief eating. Donna summed it up perfectly when she told me she had her eating under control and then was totally blindsided by eating anything she could get her hands on. That's a really good description of the whole relief eating cycle. This isn't Donna self-sabotaging, which is what a lot of women think this is. It's an eating system doing exactly what it's designed to do. But once you can recognize the hungering, you can work with it to find non-food solutions. And before I go any further with relief eating, it's also important to differentiate between relief and comfort eating. Comfort eating and relief eating are completely different. Comfort eating is probably what we normally call emotional eating. That's the type about soothing yourself, where you eat something to make yourself feel better. And usually it's enjoyable. You might have some guilt about how much you ate later or what you ate later, but it's not about shame. You might want to think about comfort eating as giving yourself a treat, right? That could be a chocolate bar, could be anything. We've all got our comfort foods. Where relief eating is like a treatment. It's about resolving a deeper disturbance. And it's not about pleasure. It's really about getting relief in the true sense of that word, which is why I think it's an important distinction to use language that's appropriate and really hits the mark. And most women tell me it is about relief, which is why I've named it relief eating. So this relief eating is faster, it's more urgent, and it's less conscious. It runs until the disturbance stops and the system balances. Relief eating is also mostly done in private. And as I've said, shame is the dominant emotion once you've finished. So let's have a look at what relief eating looks like in action. Imagine a woman, let's call her Marie, and after a period of prolonged stress, Marie feels a deep physical and emotional disturbance that starts to trigger some of her childhood fears. In her body, she feels unsettled. In her mind, the voices are going. She might try to tell herself that everything's okay. She might try to distract them by telling herself that everything's fine. But by this stage, her system has started to respond. So this is the hungering phase that I was mentioning earlier. Hours later, when the family have gone to bed, she finds herself in the pantry. Within minutes, she's eaten chocolates, biscuits, maybe a packet of nuts, maybe a packet of crisps. Then she heads over to the fridge and starts in on the ice cream. She's not tasting much, and her mind has gone quiet. Maybe even her senses have really narrowed down. This is the eating phase of relief eating, and it's all about bringing that emotional level down as quickly as possible. Once that disturbance inside of her subsides, she comes back to the present. She might look down and see the wrappers of the biscuits, the chocolates, and maybe even the empty ice cream container. And that's when the shame sets in. She promises she'll never do this again. But it's not a conscious choice. She's not unconscious, but it's not like she is fully conscious about what's happening. But the point is that if that old childhood fear that set off this whole cycle never gets treated in any other way, then the eating will happen again. The system always needs to rebalance itself. It's not personal. So let me summarize the 3 stages of how to recognize each stage. So stage 1 is this hungering stage. It's the earliest warning sign that things are getting out of balance. So you might feel tense or restless or maybe wired. And as I said, some women feel blank and numb. The hungering itself can actually start many days before the actual event of eating. It can build slowly, but also it feels like it hits really quickly. But this is the greatest point of change that you've got. If you are able to recognize early what's going on, you can start to head off the eating phase, and you can also start to look for solutions that are not based around eating. So stage 2 is the eating phase. And once that relief kicks in, the system takes over. So women describe it often to me as zoning out or going into a trance or losing track of time. And a very common one is that they talk about eating in a kind of narrowed tunnel. It's like tunnel vision. It's important to realize that the goal of the eating system is simple, and that is to bring the level of emotion down as fast as possible. This is why highly processed foods like chocolate are commonly used, because they work quickly. And in that eating phase, it feels often like you're on autopilot. And in many ways, this is true. So let's talk about what happens in stage 3, which I call the resolution. The moment the system balances, the eating stops. That's when you kind of come to again. You move out of that autopilot phase and you come back to being conscious. It's really common for women to want to hide the evidence. And they also promise or threaten maybe that they'll never do this again. This is when shame sets in and it becomes the dominant emotion of relief eating. But it's not the right response, even though it seems to be automatic, because the cause is the emotional disturbance that pushed the eating system into action. In this sense, shame isn't the cause of relief eating. The cause is the emotional disturbance that pushed the eating system into action in the first place. Once you understand that, then everything can start to shift about it. And hopefully, with my explanation, that the shame itself can be pushed to one side, so you might be able to see accurately what's happening here. And it's not a personal failure. That's the most important thing I want you to get out of this episode. So, Carla, thanks for your question. Relief eating is one of the biggest contributors to weight regain because you can just take in so many calories not being conscious. And being able to break that part of the eating cycle is, again, one of the things that's really going to be able to make a change, not only to your weight, to the way that you think about yourself, but also just to the whole weight story that you've got. But relief eating is the one that's usually the least understood. And because it's usually has to be done in private, as I said, that the shame and secrecy that surrounds it is one of the most damaging things. But even if you can gain a small amount of clarity about it, you can change the way that you understand the whole weight story that you've got. And then, of course, we can start to identify what are the actions that you can take, particularly the ones that actually don't involve restricting what you're eating. So if you have a question of your own, you can leave it in the comments or email me at hellowaitingforhappiness.com.au. Thanks for listening. And if you found this episode helpful, please leave a rating so other women can find the podcast too. I'll talk with you next week.